Well, I think it'd be worth diving into sort of the history of Islam, and the history of Muhammad, because you've been doing this for so long. You've looked at all these sources, you've looked at all these documents and maps, and goodness knows what else. So take us through, like, from the point, from sort of, if we can go sort of from the point of Christ's ascension, and the church is established, and the gospel's being spread. And then, as far as the Islamic narrative goes, along strolls Muhammad, who's then selected by the angel Jibril to have a revelation from God, from Allah. Where do we go from here? Like, how do we know what's fact and what's fiction?
Okay, right there, everything you've just said. Do you believe it?
Well, that's the thing. Is that's what we're told. And
from
that's
whom?
it's what we're told from imams, from
and where do the imams
Quran.
get their material? Where do the imams get their material from?
It'd be from the hadiths, the Quran.
And when were the hadiths written?
Well, a couple hundred years after the Quran.
You want to know when?
Go for it.
Al-Bukhari is probably the most famous, right, of the hadith. Al-Bukhari is certainly the most prolific. He's called Sahih for a reason. Sahih means perfect, without error. And that's why everybody quotes him. They have to quote him because he is so prolific. Sahih Bukhari, the first documents we have for Sahih Bukhari, you have been told, come from Al-Bukhari himself, who died in 870. Muhammad died in 632. Already, you're talking about 240 years after the fact. That's bad enough, is it not? Because that means Al-Bukhari never heard Muhammad. He never heard a word he said, and yet he seems to have known everything that Muhammad said. Yet we don't have any documentation at all from 870 or earlier, because he died in 870. So we have nothing from the 9th century. So when is the earliest documentation we have? When is the first extant manuscript for this man named Al-Bukhari? It doesn't appear to the 14th century. Did you hear what I've just said?
Really? The 14th century?
That's 500 years after the fact. We have nothing earlier than that for Al-Bukhari.
Wow.
Now, this is the first time you're hearing it, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Now,
yeah.
It was not the same question asked of our documents. Because remember, Al-Bukhari, Sahih Bukhari, are the hadith, the sayings of Muhammad. We have the same we have the same genre in Christianity. We've got the sayings of Jesus, do we not? In Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John.
Yes.
The red letters. Whenever you see Jesus speaking, they write it in red letters. That's called the sayings, the hadith of Jesus. And we also have the biography of Jesus. Biography of Jesus is written in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, the black letters, the majority part of what Jesus did. Now, we have been asked that since the 1800s of when did those get written down? And we've had to come up with documentation because we can no longer just give them the Sinaiticus or the Alexandrinus or the Vaticanus from the 4th century. We had to go back to the John Rhinan's manuscript. We had to go back to the Bodmer Papyrus there in Switzerland. We had to go back to the Chester Beatty manuscripts, which are from the 2nd, 3rd, 4th. And it wasn't until the 4th century that finally we get an entire New Testament written in Greek that was preserved on parchment so that we could look at it today. The first complete extant manuscript is the Sinaiticus, which is, 325. So we're talking 4th century. And we have been vilified by everybody for that. 400 years later, how can you trust it? Well, look at this. The same genre in Islam that supports the sayings of Muhammad are not written down till the 14th century. Muhammad died in the 7th century. That is 700 years later, and we have nothing earlier than that. Sahih Muslim is the 14th century. Tirmidhi, let me just look at what Tirmidhi is. Tirmidhi would be the 12th century. Nisai, Majah, Ibn Dawud, they're all 13th and 14th century. So we have nothing before the 13th century for any of the hadith. Let's get to the biography of Muhammad. Let's look about that. The black letter of what we call Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John for the biography of Jesus, that would be 4th century for the entirety of it. But we have parts of it in John's Gospel from the 2nd century. Let's see what they have for their biography. That's called the Sirah. The Sirah to Rasulullah. That would be the extant manuscript. Who wrote that down? Every Muslim will tell you, and probably until just now, you would have quoted me if I had asked you. It'd be Ibn Hisham, who died in 833. Muhammad died in 632. That's 200 years. That's what we have been told. That's what you know. That's what everybody knows. You know, we don't have anything of Ibn Hisham. In fact, the story that you have to read about Muhammad, everything he did, that you thought was attributed to Ibn Hisham was written by a guy named Alfred Guillaume, but he didn't actually do and put the material together. Alfred Guillaume went to a guy in Germany named Wustenfeld. Heinrich Friedrich Wustenfeld is the one that first wrote down the story of Muhammad, and he wrote it down. You want to hear the date? You ready?
Go for it.
Wustenfeld is I want to get it right, 1860. That's the 19th century. Everything we know about Muhammad, what he did, comes from a German scholar writing in Berlin between 1858 and 1860. That 2-year period he put together the story of Muhammad, then published it. Alfred Guillaume then translated it, and that's what we read today. That's the 19th century. That's just 160 years ago. Now, this is the first time you're hearing that, right?
That's incredible. Like so essentially what we hear from the Dawagandis, the people who push Islam and give dawah and things like that, they bring all these things of like, oh, we know everything about Muhammad, it's all been perfectly preserved, we have one Quran, you've got several hundred Bibles and things like that. This is just flipping it on its head.
Puts everything on. Now, we're not talking about the Quran now. Remember, we're not even getting to the Quran. The Quran's even worse. That's a whole nother kettle of fish. We could do a whole nother thing on that because we're talking about Muhammad this time. Just looking at what Muhammad did and said, his seerah and his sayings. And then we get to the tafsir and the tahriq, which would be the commentaries that unpack the Quran, and then the histories that lead up to Muhammad. All of those are attributed to a guy named Al-Tabari who died in 923. That's the 10th century. We have nothing from 923. Where do we get Al-Tabari? What manuscript do we get? Where is his manuscript? There is none. Not from the 10th century. We have to go to, here you go, 1879 to 1901. And this is a Dutch scholar. His name is, I'm going to get it right, Michael Jan de Geoje, Geoje, however you want to pronounce that. He's a Dutch scholar who was writing in Leiden University there in Holland up until the last century. And he finally tabulated and finalized it in 1901. That's a little over 100 years ago. For all that we know about the commentaries and also the history of Islam and the history of the world. Can you see how incredible? And this is just getting out now. The Germans are finally bringing this to the fore, and they're feeding it to me, and I'm trying to get it up onto the internet so the world can see it. Can you now understand why we have nothing like this problem in Christianity? We have nothing close to this. Because really, our New Testament is nothing more than the sirah, the hadith, the tafsir, and the tahriq of Jesus Christ. Those are the genres. Nothing was written by Jesus himself. It was written about him. It was written about what he did. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was written about what he said. Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. It was written about what he meant, about taking out and applying it. That's the letters of Paul. And then, of course, the history of the early church, that's Luke and the book of Acts. So we have the same genre in the New Testament. So if you want to compare the New Testament and compare it, you need to compare it with the 4 traditions, the sirah, the hadith, the tafsir, and the tahriq. That's what you really have to compare it with. Because we're talking about books that were written by those who saw Jesus, heard Jesus, and then applied what Jesus did in Ephesus and in Corinth and in Philippi and in Rome. That's why do like with like, and when you do like with like, our material starts to appear in the 2nd century, is finalized and completed by the 4th century, taking it from material from people that were writing. Listen, just look at the dates that they were written. Paul was writing his letters the earliest within 15 years of Christ's death. He died in 62 AD. So within 30 years of Christ's death, you already have all of his letters written and the book of Romans written. And then you get Luke's writing. That's within 20 years of Christ's death. You get Mark and you get Matthew and Mark. Matthew and Mark, who are writing within 40 years of Christ's death. You have Luke, who's written within 50 years of Christ's death. And then you have John, who's written within 60 years of Christ's death. So every one of these 4 genres, the hadith, the sirah, the tafsir, and the tahriq of Jesus Christ, are written within 60 years of Christ's death. Everything we know about Islam is written between 400 to 800 years of Muhammad's death. Which do you think is more authoritative?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, if you're going to do any form of historical work, even looking at things like Alexander the Great or, Genghis Khan, things like that, you look at the earliest possible source you can.
You always do that.
Always. It's just how you do history, and this is something that you hear all the time from Muslims is, oh well, your first Bible comes out 400 years after the thing, and no, I'm sorry, when we're looking, with the evidence that you're putting forward now, about the real timeline, of as to the earliest we can genuinely go to our earliest manuscript is damning. It shows that the Muslims cannot use this argument anymore.
They cannot. And I'm not even put this up. What I'm telling you, I'm not even put up on the YouTube yet. You're getting it before I put it up. This is all yet to be put up. You're going to be the first. You're one of the first to hear it. I just got back from Nigeria introducing it there. I was in Ethiopia introducing it. The Africans all know about it. They wanted this first because they're on the battle lines, unlike you are. That's why they need it more than anybody else. But see how much this just destroys the whole edifice of Islam. Now, that's just Muhammad. Take a look and ask and say, where did he come from? Who is this guy? Where is this name Muhammad anywhere in the 7th century? Show me that word Muhammad, written anywhere in the 7th century.